gentlemen, thank you for coming back on time. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who has been variously a researcher in pharmaceuticals. He's been an athletics coach. He's founded a foundation called Spirit Aid, which is for international relief, and he's published author of 7 best-selling books. He is one of these people, I think, who are extraordinarily inspiring. He's asked for a very low-maintenance introduction. I'll try not to go any further with the compliments, so without any further ado, Dr. David Hamilton.
Thank you. When I said that's the low maintenance introduction, I was basically saying that I don't really mind how you introduced me. I've had all ranges of introduction. I did one in New York City. I spoke at this, but it was my first American conference. First big American. You know, America's huge. It's like this place called the Javits Center in New York. It's half the size of a football stadium, and I was really nervous because I've never spoken to such a big audience before. I was really nervous. And my publisher was saying, "No, you'll be great. We want to get in this to mix you up with the Americans." And when I arrived there, I realised that all the other speakers were regulars on Oprah. And one of them had their own primetime show on the ABC network on a Saturday night. So that doubled my nerves. Because I'm like, there's 2,000 people here. I think 3 know me. But then what relaxed me is I was the third speaker, and I realised that there was a pattern that the events director at the beginning of the day, the introduction, she did these amazing introductions that were like 5 minutes long. And literally, by the time she's finished reading through all people's achievements and all the things they've done, the books they've sold and all that, the audience are at the edge of their seat. So when the person walk on the stage, they get a standing ovation. And I'm thinking, well, at least Nancy warms them up really well. That'll be really great. That'll relax me. At least it'll be a nice introduction. So the first 2 speakers got this like huge, immense introduction, and I come on and I'm standing at the back of the stage, and Nancy walks on and she said, "So our next speaker is David Hamilton from across the pond." And all you heard was. And then because your anxiety just spikes then, in pure comedy fashion, I then tripped onto the stage. And it was like a monitor thing that starts counting down right in front of your eyes. And the moment I walked in and said it goes, "It's 90 minutes, 90, 89, 59. And your tongue goes really dry. And because they had a break just before I came on, there was an aerobics guy who came on and warmed everyone up. He came on for 2 minutes, got everyone stretching, and took my water. So I'm now standing for 90 minutes with my tongue completely dry, heart beating, really, really nervous. But I got through it. I stumbled through my first American talk. So that's why I didn't really mind what kind of introduction, because once you've had an introduction like that, anything's a blessing. But today I'm going to talk to you a wee bit about mind, body, mind over matter, that kind of stuff. Some of you have probably heard me talking on some of this before, but most of you, I think, hopefully haven't heard me speak, which is good because I only have about 5 jokes. And I use them all in the same talk. I kind of got into this because I worked for a big drugs company called AstraZeneca. And I was building drugs for heart disease and cancer. And when I say build drugs, basically what that means is you stick atoms together. I was what you call an organic chemist. You stick atoms together to make this big 3-dimensional thing that fits into a wee pocket and wee switches on and off in the body, that type of stuff. But what captivated me was the power of the mind. Because when you make a drug, you've got to prove that it works. And the way that you prove that it works is you give 100 people, for example, the drug, and you give 100 people a placebo, a fake version of the drug. And it's usually made of, chalk, sugar, bit of super glue, a lot of super glue, binding agents that hold it all together. But there's nothing chemical in it. But what amazed me is, my main field was heart disease. And it wasn't uncommon to have maybe 75 people improve on the drug. And anything from 50 to 74 improve on the placebo because they thought they were getting the drug. I just think that's extraordinary. And the more you look into it, nowadays you can see if you take an MRI brain scan of a person getting a drug, And they've done this for antidepressants, they've done this for various pain medications. Take an MRI of a person getting the drug, take an MRI of a person who thinks they're getting the drug, it's a placebo, and they're identical. If you mix them up, you can't tell which is which. You take out all the colours and map them on top of each other, they're almost identical. And what it demonstrates is when you think or believe something, you actually produce chemistry in your body and inside your brain. And I use the example, I often say that, I'm a trained chemist, but actually all of us are chemists, if you really think about it. Because the moment you think, you change brain chemistry. So if, for example, we all know this one about stress, if you think of something that causes you stress, think of a person who really bulging gets under your skin. And when you do that, you start to produce stress chemistry in the brain. And that eventually targets the adrenal glands and starts changing chemistry about the body. And if you consistently think in that way, then you start to build up two families of chemicals that eventually have a hand in cardiovascular disease. And that's why people talk about the link between stress and cardiovascular disease. That actually depends on what you believe, I suppose, as well. But bear in mind, you're doing this in your mind. This is stuff you're thinking about, and you're changing the chemistry of your blood. Right? Let's say, on the other hand, you had to think of someone you love. And think times when you felt affection, a connection between that person. You produce different chemistry in the brain. And if you consistently think in that way, then rather than producing those little chemicals that lead to heart disease, you produce something completely opposite. You actually produce a little neurohormone called oxytocin, which acts like a wee sweeping brush, and it actually sweeps your arteries out of all the crap, so to speak. And the fact that thinking of stuff that bugs you and thinking of people that you love, the fact that in both people, if I take blood samples of both, the fact that blood is red, that's about where the similarities end. But the chemistry is vastly different, and you're doing it in your head. Isn't that amazing? And so that's why I say I think we're all chemists. You're doing the chemistry all the time, you just don't notice you're doing the chemistry all the time. So there becomes a skill in choosing what to think about that leads to particular effects in the body. I think that's kind of cool, it's kind of interesting. Before I get into that, I bet you everyone in this room has experienced a placebo effect, right? Hands up if you've ever taken an aspirin or a paracetamol. Right, so pretty much everyone. So you will have experienced a placebo effect. And I'm not saying aspirin and paracetamol don't work, because of course they do. But the fact that you go into a shop and buy it means that you must expect it to work. You must believe in it in some level. So the fact that you believe in it actually causes it to work better. If you didn't believe in it, it wouldn't work quite as well. And we know that because lots of work's been done in this kind of vein. I'll give you an example. If you go into a big supermarket, you can buy paracetamol, how much is it today, about 15 pence, something like that. Panadol, most people know paracetamol and Panadol are pretty much the same thing. Panadol roughly 10 times the price, right? £1.50, right? So most people know paracetamol and Panadol are the same thing, yet one is 10 times the price. Now, if you use the aspirin statistics, because research has been done on aspirin, it's similar to Panadol. And what you can say if you use these statistics is Panadol is about 25% better than paracetamol. And you think, how on earth? Because it's the same thing. You know why it's 25% better? Yeah, it's 10 times the price. So we have this wee story in our heads, this wee thing that says if something's more expensive, then it must be better. Right? And that little thought itself creates that little expectation that we expect something more of it. And that little thought, thinking process in your own brain, in your own mind, actually makes it work better. And what you can get, if you totally didn't believe in that kind of stuff at all, you would suppress its effects. So the difference between the best something could be and the worst something could be is in your own head. It's in what you think about the drug, or what you think about the doctor, therapist, hypnotherapist, whatever. Your thoughts about the person. If you want to ramp up the effects of yourself, empathy is the key. Actually empathising, connecting, making a bond, and then people feel connected to you, they're more likely to believe in you, so to speak. Now, a similar kind of thing goes on with Viagra. I'm not asking for a show of hands. We know who we are. Sorry, you know who you are. But, one of the interesting little ways that Viagra works, outside of the chemistry, is through its name Viagra. And this taps into a clever little mechanism of how the brain works. See, the brain, you remember stuff by association. Right? If one thing sounds like or looks like, there's an association and there's a connection. Right? There's all these amazing memory systems. I teach a memory system where I can memorise over a deck of cards in a couple of minutes, and it's basically just on, using little associations. And it's just, that's pretty much how the brain works when it comes to remembering stuff. But Viagra works, it gets some of its power through this kind of stuff. Because Viagra happens to sound a bit like Niagara. Right? And what's Niagara? It's power, it's bigger, it's also straight. And frothy and stuff like that. I can stop there. I think you get the picture. So when a person takes Viagra, part of the meaning of the symbol Niagara, because words are really symbols, aren't they? Words have no meaning in and of themselves. They're symbols that point towards something. Right? So the symbol Niagara, part of that energy, the meaning of it leaks into or informs, it's associated with the word Viagra just through sound. So when a person takes Viagra, it works slightly better because it's called Viagra. Think about it. The opposite way, would it work quite as well if it was called Flopsy? I doubt it. Yeah. So the difference between the best it could be and the worst it could be similarly is in your own head, isn't it? It's in something that you think or something that you believe perhaps unconsciously, but it's still in the capacities of your thinking to make it work better or worse. So I think all those kind of things are really cool. And we're affecting the health, the systems of our body all of the time. We just don't notice it. We're doing it all the time. Any hands up who meditates regularly in here? Oh, quite a lot. More than half, which is great. 3/4. Well, I can tell actually because most long-term meditators have thicker heads. I'm not kidding. No, but if you had to cut a slice off the top of your head, not that you would ever recommend doing it, and measure the thickness of the bit above your eyes, called the bit of the brain above the eyes, called the prefrontal cortex, you'll find that it's thicker and more dense in connectivity than people who don't practice meditation. And that's because of what you're doing with your mind. So anything's a meditation if you give it your full attention. You can meditate while drinking water if you give that your complete attention. You can meditate while ironing clothes if you give that your absolute attention. Classically, we sit and we go, and we listen to the sound of our breath or whatever. But what you're doing with meditation is you're paying attention to something, and that activates this part of the brain here. And when you activate consistently a part of the brain, you fertilise it in a simple kind of way. And what that does is it helps it to grow. So it's like fertilising plants, and they start to grow more branches, more leaves and stuff. And what you get is increase in connections at the front of the brain. And as these connections get more and more dense, they actually push the cells apart in the fluid. So what you end up getting is a thicker and more dense area at the front. So long-term meditation, you do actually have thicker heads. No, it doesn't push against your skull or anything. It just takes up more different space in the brain. Actually, talk about meditation, this is just an aside. There's a holistic retreat centre I sometimes use in Scotland. And I first used it, years ago and I never heard of a mantra before. People do mantras like Om Mani Padme Hum and stuff, and Om, the classic one. And I was on this, it was a firewalking workshop, right? I'd done a firewalk with Tony Robbins a few years earlier, but this is my first ever kind of spiritual firewalk. And I went to the loo, and I looked at it, and on they tried to be really polite in this place, and on the back of the door, they've got a little symbol, like a wee spiritual symbol, and it says Om Mani Padme Hum. And then underneath it said, "Would the lovely ladies please put the sanitary items in the bin?" I thought it was a literal translation. So you can imagine my surprise halfway through the workshop and we're all chanting Om Mani Padme Hum. And I'm thinking, this place is weird. That was the first time I'd ever heard. So I was blown out of the pharmaceutical industry, so I'd been in a lab bench for years. I'd been really totally into the science stuff. This was my first kind of spiritual kind of thing, so it was an interesting awakening. It was years before I actually knew that wasn't the literal translation. Anyway, coming back to meditation. Here's another cool thing about meditation. Even people who have never practiced meditation before, one piece of research at Harvard invited people to do 20 minutes of meditation, just basic, mindfulness meditation, 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks, and they had blood samples taken at the start and at the end of the time period. Did a genetic analysis of the blood, and guess what happened? The practice of meditation had impacted 1,561 genes. That's about 6% of the human genome. Impacted. And what I mean by impacted is you can switch a gene off or turn it up, or switch it off, turn it down, up-regulate, down-regulate. And 874 have been turned up, and 687 have been turned down. And you might wonder, what does that mean? Well, basically, if you knock all the stats out, it basically showed that meditation was slowing the aging process quite profoundly, because it was changing the different proteins inside the body. And I think that's amazing, because you're doing this in your mind, aren't you? I mean, if you can impact 6% of the human genome by something you're doing in your mind, what does that say? I mean, how amazing is that? And I like talking about these kind of things because I think we don't realise just how much we do these things all the time. We don't realise how powerful we are actually to have a powerful effect upon the body. So meditation has a profound effect on the aging process. I can testify to this because in November last year I turned 83. I actually have to put grey dye in my hair just to look a bit more my age. I'm only 65, but I am prone to exaggeration from time to time. But so meditation does have this powerful effect, and again, what I'm trying to get across here is, I think, especially in the West, we grew up thinking that the mind is this, and thoughts are these floaty things that disappear off in the ether. But actually, your mind, your thinking, you can think of it like a force. Because as you think, and you start to play around with the chemistry of the brain, the chemistry of your blood, then what your thoughts are really like forces, right? You can think of them as forces, because a thought pushes something. Like, think a thought consistently of love actually dilates your blood vessels, drops your blood pressure. And how cool is that? You think love, and you keep thinking affection, 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 and your blood vessels will dilate because of the changes in the hormones inside your body. And you do it in your mind. Right? And I think these kind of things are amazing, because it completely turns on its head the kind of stuff we learned growing up. When I was growing up, I went to a Catholic school, and we were taught that mind over matter is supernatural, and it's something to be feared, and the work of the devil kind of thing. So you can imagine, I was afraid of all these kind of things. If someone said mind over matter, I went, what are you talking about? Kind of thing. But we're doing it all the time. We just don't notice that we're doing it all the time. So in fact, another way that we're doing this all the time is even in attitude. In fact, did you know that your attitude, in the sense of your emotional style, and I'm trying to think of emotional style, I guess what it really means is how the way in which you react to events in life. So if you have a positive emotional style, let's say you're running late for a talk, which I was kind of doing this morning. I only arrived here at 10:30 after boarding a flight at 7 o'clock in Edinburgh. But with a positive emotional style, when potentially stressful things happen, you find a way around it. It's not the end of the world. You manage to cope and find a way around it without getting too stressed. Right? A negative emotional style, on the other hand, we would probably react really severely to that event. I'm talking two extremes to make a point here. So it might be a huge deal, and you go on about it, and it becomes a huge part of your day, and you can't let it go, and you're wrapping right around you. It really intensifies your anger and frustration. And we're all there sometimes, What ultimately matters, and that has no bearing on your health at all, really. What matters is where you are consistently over a long period of time. That's when you can start to see how attitude interacts with longevity. And they say that people with a positive emotional style tend to live about 7.5 years longer. And it's really just because of the less stress than getting ourselves in a flap all the time. But a clever little experiment looked at the effect of that type of attitude on the immune system. And volunteers were recruited who were given nasal drops containing the cold or the flu virus. Right? So your one group had to go at that with, rhinovirus, basic cold virus. One group, you got influenza A, and the next group did a line of cocaine, just to no, but so they were given these, the cold or flu virus, and then they were put in quarantine for a fortnight. And every time they produced mucus, they were to blow it out with a hanky, and the hanky was put in a Ziploc bag. And at the end of the day, one of the technicians would come along and pick up everyone's individual Ziploc bags. It's got your name on it. The airport bags you get, you put your toiletries and stuff in. So everybody filled it up with their handkerchiefs full of mucus. And at the end of the time, the scientists would weigh out everyone's individual bags, subtract out the weight of the plastic by working out how many bags they used, and the weight of the handkerchiefs, and get a net weight of mucus. Right? It turns out that your emotional style is very related to how much mucus you produce. People with a negative emotional style produce, from that study, about twice as much mucus as people with a positive emotional style. Amazing, eh? And it just demonstrates that on a daily basis how we affect how things work in the body. We just don't notice it, we do it. And I think if we notice it, we do it, then we can start to choose certain things that are kind of healthy, I suppose. Another way that attitude affects you very profoundly is in the heart. In fact, one of my favourite pieces of research is called Marital Conflict Relations and Coronary Artery Calcification. There you go. Marital conflict relations and coronary artery calcification. And that's when scientists took 150 married couples, they put them in a room one couple at a time, and asked them to chat about a topic of their choice from their marriage. And they suggested a few topics, right, that they could talk about. Nice little room, a little couch and a video camera pointing at them as well. And what they did is they videotaped them having this conversation. And then what they did is they categorised them according to the quality of their relationships. Right? So for most couples, if it's a 30-minute chat, most couples for the first 10 minutes will play to the camera, knowing that there's a camera watching them having a marital conversation. Most people are on their best behaviour, so they throw away the first 10 minutes of video. They chuck away the next 10 as well, because people have just begun to settle in. The last 10 minutes they use, because that's the time when security are most often called in. But when they watch these wee segments of video, when they watch these video back, they start to categorise the couples into the quality of their relationship. At one end of the extreme, you have the couples who are most hostile. Right? They call hostile aggressive. And males it's referred to as type A personality. So hostile, aggressive, domineering, bullying kind of thing. And women become defensive and aggressive and want to fight back. If words were objects and daggers would pin the other to the wall type thing. The other end of the extreme, you had those who seem to be displaying more love, kindness and compassion and empathy. More touch, more tactile, more a demonstration of a bond between them, a heartfelt bond. So very heart-centred. This group over here were absolutely not heart-centred. Well, it turned out this group had high levels of CAC, or coronary artery calcification. It's when the coronary artery moves from having the internal consistency of a lightly poached egg to something resembling plasterboard. This group over here had very healthy arteries. And if you take out the equation the effect of diet, lifestyle, all that kind of thing, the only difference between the groups are in how they relate to each other, how they communicate. And this and lots of research now suggests that if it was your goal to develop hardening of the arteries, one of the most efficient ways of doing it is to hate people and express it. That's not advice, by the way. I'm just saying. But hostility is now one of the most accurate predictors of cardiovascular disease. If you ask people to fill in a questionnaire based on diet and lifestyle, you can make a prediction of the likelihood of cardiovascular effects later down the line. You can fill out a 25-point personality questionnaire and get the same stats just as easily, based on where a person's personality falls, how they relate to other people. And all I'm really using that as an example for us to get across just how powerfully our thinking and behaviour affects us all the time. We just don't really notice it, we don't really pay attention to it. But some of the things that I think are really cool is just how, looking at this group over here, how they had so little coronary artery calcification, even though some of this group undoubtedly would have had really poor diets. And you think, isn't that weird? How sometimes thinking and behaviour can overrule the effects. I mean, there was a study not too recently that looked at the relationship between stress and longevity. And some of you might have saw there was a TED talk on this kind of stuff recently. It's really, really cool. And basically what the study found is that it was a long-term study with hundreds of thousands of people. And people were quizzed about how much stress they experienced on a consistent basis. And then, you know, a decade or so later, this is people from ages 20 up to the 90s, a decade or so later, they used public records to find out who was still alive, who had died, etc. And what you're trying to do with these kind of studies is provide a correlation between lifespan and, you know, a likelihood of dying earlier or something, and how much stress a person experiences. That's what you would expect. But what they cleverly done in the study is they asked people about their attitude to stress. Because some people who get really stressed actually believe stress is good for them. Some people who hardly get any stress are really so paranoid about it, think stress is such a bad thing, they're terrified of it. And it turns out your attitude to stress can actually change the chemistry of stress in the body. And what they found is, of the group who were highly strung, of that group, the ones who thought it was good for them, they were actually much healthier, their death rate was much lower. But yet the other end of the extreme, those who were hardly stressed at all, but who believed that stress is really bad for you, their death rate was really high. So the death rate was higher in the people with low stress, but who believed it was bad for them, than it was in the people with high stress who believed it was good for them. And if you extract the statistics, in the year of that study, it turned out that the belief in stress itself, not stress, but the belief in stress, was responsible for the deaths of 182,000 people in the United States. And according to that TED talk, it meant that the belief in stress was the 15th leading cause of death in the United States. And it just shows you how believing something can have a huge effect. And in a kind of reverse type way, some of this group over here who had, you know, very healthy arteries, whose relationship was really good, some of them probably had really poor diets. But it just so happened that the way in which we think and relate to each other can overrule some of that, and partly that's because of a little hormone called oxytocin that we produce when we're expressing love, affection, kindness, compassion, anything that creates empathy, that creates a bond, a warm communication, a sense of warm connection between people, and you literally turn on a tap. So this group here had lots of oxytocin flowing. What oxytocin does, it attaches itself to the lining of the arteries. It spits out nitric oxide through a little wee domino effect. And what the nitric oxide does, not nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas, nitric oxide, it makes your blood vessels flow up and they expand. And when that happens, your blood pressure drops. So anything that causes a connection, kindness, compassion, love, affection, is called cardioprotective. Right? Protects the cardiovascular system. And again, a lot of this you're doing in your head. Right? So this group over here, who are creating oxytocin through affection, through even thinking affectionate thoughts, because thinking and feeling does the same thing in many ways as actually connecting, actually physically contacting. So they were producing so much oxytocin, it was reversing the effects of poor lifestyle, or counteracting it. Whereas this group over here, some of them had really healthy lifestyles, but yet they had high levels of heart disease, because they'd no cardioprotection from the oxytocin, there's no love and affection and compassion and connection. So that was literally reducing levels of oxytocin, taking away this possibility for a healthy set of blood vessels. So we're doing this kind of stuff all of the time. And it's amazing. We produce oxytocin every time we really bond. In fact, hugging someone produces oxytocin. There was a study that is really good for the heart. So there was a study that looked at 59 married women and asked them to keep a diary over 4 weeks of all the hugs they experienced. So some people had a lot of hugs, some people every couple of days, some people 5 or 6 a day. And it turns out the number of hugs a person experiences is directly related to how much oxytocin you have in your bloodstream. And people with the most amount of hugs had the highest oxytocin. So I coined a new phrase after this: a hug a day keeps the cardiologist away. Made it up. But it's cool. There was actually, back in the 80s, this is just an aside, there was a wee study, and this shows the importance of bonding and empathy. There was a wee study that was, in the early days, investigating the effects of diet and how that affects the cardiovascular system. And scientists were actually studying the arteries of rabbits And some rabbits had a high fat and cholesterol content diet, and others didn't. And what they were finding is, when the rabbits had a high fat and cholesterol content diet, they had very high levels of atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries. But there was an enigma in this study, some that didn't make any sense, because one small group of rabbits had 60% less heart disease than the others, and they thought, couldn't work it out. And the scientists are racking their brains saying, what on earth happened? Why is it? They thought it was a different breed, maybe a different genetic strain, something in the feed even that was somehow protecting them from heart disease. And they were almost about to give up. They couldn't figure it out until one of the technicians came and said, I know you said to report anything. Well, you know, I lock up the lab at night. And see, when I go away, I feel sorry for that wee group of rabbits. So I take them out their pens and I stroke them. Just for 10 minutes. And the scientists are like, that interesting. So they did the experiment again. This time they asked her, rabbit number 7, rabbit number 14, 12, 21, etc. Specific rabbits. Every night, we go home, I want you to hug them and hold them. Did the study, 60% less hardening of the arteries. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. And it demonstrates the effect of connection. And it's the same type of phenomenon you see in that piece of research, marital conflict relations and coronary artery calcification. Right? It's the same phenomenon. And it's how you relate to people. So as therapists, how you relate to people plays a big role in people's health. You just don't notice it. Empathy is a huge thing. But I think as our world becomes more interconnected, empathy is the currency for thriving. Right? As the world, we become more embedded in social networks, the ability to relate to and connect, especially as therapists, is a huge ace card. It's a huge trump card. Learning how to connect and that, because it has, in and of itself, it has health-giving benefits. So another piece of thing that fascinates me is go beyond this and learning how even imagination, not just connecting now, but what if you were imagining stuff? Can that have physical effects in the body? Well, absolutely. Harvard done an amazing piece of research. A professor called Alvaro Pascal-Leon, one of the world's most famous neuroscientists, did this really clever study where they got a group of volunteers, novice piano players, not piano players, but literally just to sit in front of a piano and go plonk, 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 up and down a scale, 2 hours, Monday to Friday, right? Not 2 hours consistent, that's kind of sore. It's something like a minute on, 2 or 3 minutes rest, a minute on, 2 or 3 minutes rest, something like that. But for all intents and purposes, you're going at it for 2 hours, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They had the brain imaged every day, using a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a bit like, how you can take a ship or a boat over the ocean and you can use sound waves to work out how deep the ocean is. Right? It's similar. It's not exactly the same, but there's similarities and therefore you can work out the size of an area of the brain. And what they found is the area of the brain connected to the finger muscles began to grow every day. And by the Friday, 5th day, the area after the 5th session, the area of the brain connected to the finger muscles was about 20, 30, 40 times bigger than it was on the Monday. Right? Demonstrating a phenomenon called neuroplasticity. Basically, it says the brain is not as hardwired as you think in this bit over here, but it changes in response to your experiences and what you learn, even what you think and imagine in life. But here's the crux of the study. They got another group of people, instead of physically playing the piano, they have to do it in their heads. So for the same 2 hours, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they sat and went, plonk, 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 plonk. They didn't actually nod their heads, I'm just doing that for effect. Some of them probably did though. But most of it, basically just sat and pretended you're playing piano and imagine the sound, make it as real as you can. Their brain scanned every day, amazingly. Same area of the brain, good. And by the Friday, same area of the brain was something like 20, 30, 40 times bigger than it was on the Monday. And if you mixed up the slides from the Friday from those who physically played piano, those who imagined played the piano, and mixed them up, you couldn't really tell who was from which group. In other words, in many ways, the brain does not distinguish between whether you're doing something or whether you're imagining doing it. Right? And the line, because a lot of research has gone into this at the moment, and the line between real and imaginary is becoming ever so blurred. And what you imagine to be true, for all intents and purposes, is real for the brain. In fact, after you've imagined it, it's a memory. It's already happened because it's coded in the brain. It's there as a memory, right? So the difference between real, imaginary, and forward thinking and past, it's all rolling into a single moment. It's now, in a funny kind of way. And But what I love about this study is it demonstrates that you are changing the physical structure of your brain through your imagination. Now, let's say, I think of these kind of things. Earlier in the talk I said, the skill becomes, understand this kind of stuff, selectively choosing ways of thinking to bring about particular effects. So let's say, take it back a bit, you want to increase your prefrontal cortex, so you practice meditation. So someone says, increase your prefrontal cortex, you sit and go, listen to your breath. So you're doing something with your mind, pointing it to something, a particular thing that you're doing and keeping it there. If someone said, dilate your arteries, then you would sit and think of people that you're connected to. Yeah. So you're producing a different effect, you're switching on a different thing with basically with your mind. If you happen to be at a dinner party and you could say to someone, by the way, see, there's a thing in the brain called the motor cortex that governs the movements of our fingers. Check this out, right? I could change the fitness in my mind. And people go, way. And if you happen to have a portable MRI scanner, let's say it's like and you've got one on your iPhone, and somebody holds it there, after a couple of hours, you'll actually see a change in that part of the motor cortex. And people say, how did you do that? It's a trick. And all you actually really did was you imagined going like that with your fingers. And I'm only using that as an example to say that we have this ability to switch on and off different things. We just need to know what way of thinking does this. I mean, we know it's been with us for decades. We know what happens if you want to switch on stress. You think of stuff that bugs you. And people that irritate you, and then you switch on stress. You want to develop cardiovascular disease, hardening of the arteries. Hate people. And keep doing it. Express that hatred. Not that you want to do that. And I'm just sure that if you can think of different things, you can actually you can literally play a tune in the systems of your body. And as we start to understand this, we can learn to play a gentler tune on our bodies instead of just going boom, 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 which most of us do all the time. You can actually start to play a nice little melody by choosing ways of thinking. And I think this kind of research into neuroplasticity through your imagination is so powerful because it shows we're actually causing an effect by something that we're doing on purpose. And scientists, when this research was first done, actually back in 1994, it took like a decade before anyone paid it any attention. Right? But scientists began to wonder, what about people imagining playing piano? Because people actually playing piano, their muscles will get stronger. But what about the ones imagining playing piano? Well, their muscles get stronger. So lots of research teams, particularly groups involved in sports science, right, helping people to apply this to sports performance. One of my favourite pieces was done at the Lerner Institute. And what they did is they asked a group of volunteers to do that with their little fingers. Right? 15 minutes a day, Monday to Friday for 3 months. It's not the most interesting piece of research if you're the person doing that with your fingers. Imagine doing that, come in for a piece of research. Right, today what I want you to do is sit in that chair and wiggle your finger. When I worked in AstraZeneca, we used to pay people thousands of pounds to take drugs for a fortnight and have your stomach line scraped. Students used to volunteer, they're called volunteer studies. I never participated. I knew it was in them. I'm only kidding. I'm not. I'm kidding. They are actually very good for you. But what was I talking about? Oh yeah, little finger. Yeah. So what they did is at the start and the end of the 3 months, they got people to lift a wee set of weights to see how strong they were. And at the end of the 3 months, the average across all the volunteers, the average gain in strength was 53%. Fair enough, because you're actually exercising. So guess what the next group of volunteers had to do? Yep. 15 minutes a day, Monday to Friday for 3 months. Of course, they're not actually wobbling their head, that's just the effect. But they're doing that in their imagination. But amazingly, when they put their fingers in a wee set of weights, the average gain in strength was 35%. Isn't that amazing? And they hadn't even lifted a finger. Now, critics will say, but it wasn't 53%. It wasn't zero. 35% increase in strength by something you're doing in your head. There's lots of research that's been done on that nowadays, even with people who've had accidents where they can't actually exercise, and finding that 2 hours of mental practice a day was actually offsetting, over a period of a couple of months, was offsetting much of the strength decrease that people lost having had an accident where they couldn't exercise. Amazing. I used to be an athletics coach. I was the manager of the under-20s team for a club called Sale Harriers in Manchester. back in the late 90s, and I used to try to teach the guys how to use their imagination and explain that the mind can't, the brain doesn't distinguish between real and imaginary. Every Olympic athlete, top-level Olympic athlete in the world uses these techniques. They've even used it in clinical settings. People have had a stroke. In fact, there's a number of studies now showing how imagination or visualization or mental imagery, as it's called in the journals, can benefit people who've had a stroke. So typically you'll get a 4-week study or a 6-week study. Everyone gets physiotherapy, maybe an hour a day or half an hour a day. Half of them, though, get an extra half hour or up to an hour, depending on the study, where they have to imagine for an hour or half an hour doing things with their impaired limbs. So if they have impairment down the right-hand side, then they would imagine, not actually moving, but imagine moving, lifting up a bottle of water, eating an apple, turning the pages of a book, routine things that they would ordinarily do. And amazingly, what you find at the end of the study is those who use imagination like that recover far more than those who just do the physiotherapy. And I'm not saying use visualization instead of physiotherapy. The ideal combination was both. And this is why when I talk about using the mind to heal the body, I'm not meaning instead of taking medical advice, instead of working with therapists, I mean in addition to. Just like you're encouraged for a whole healthy lifestyle, regardless of what illness and condition a person has, to eat healthy, to cut down on stress, to exercise well. I think what we've completely forgotten is think well and demonstrate the effectiveness of thinking well. And that's all I'm really suggesting when I'm talking about using these techniques, but just showing you just how widespread the effects can be in the systems of your body if you actually understand what you're doing. And the reason I cover the science of it is if you understand you're doing this all the time, then you start to believe in yourself. In a sense, you become your own placebo, don't you? You believe that when I do this, I'm having this effect. So just like Panadol versus paracetamol, Viagra versus Floxy, the power of what you do is amplified because you believe you're expecting something to work rather than not. So therefore, when you do it versus someone else doing it, because you understand this is happening, your effectiveness increases. And you as a therapist as well, believing and expecting these results, that expectation through what's called the mirror neuron system in the brain. People's brain mirrors the facial expressions. You have 43 muscles in your face, and you have a mirror neuron system where people can literally read your mind. They actually call it mind reading sometimes. No, they're not actually trying to read your thoughts, but basically, if you're hanging around with someone who's happy, then you'll find yourself happier. And not just because of what they say, only about 10 to 40% of the data absorbed by your brain is in what's being said. 60 to 90% is how it's being conveyed, the emotional content, the way in which you communicate, facial expressions, whether you use the zygomaticus major muscle here, or the orbicularis oculi muscle that makes you really smiley and animated and happy, or whether you're really stressed and you're using the corrugator supercilii. But whoever you're with, their brain mirrors yours, and it feeds back into their emotional circuit, so they feel how you feel. So if you really believe in what you're doing, and you're expecting results, they feel it. And I think there is a deeper, more subtle mechanism of interconnectedness, but on the primary neurological circuits, they're actually being affected by your belief, that you believe in yourself. They can feel it, in a really primary neurological way. So I've been talking about this kind of stuff, for years, and trying to get across this point that we are much stronger in the ability to affect our bodies than we think. In fact, just give it on the mirror neuron thing, just to show you how powerful this mirror neuron thing is. Scientists asked volunteers to put an elastic band around their finger and do that, right, 25 times, and do it every second day. So they've done 6 sessions of that, right? 25 reps, it's called. And at the start and the end of the study, they lifted a wee set of weights and pushed the wee bars apart on a machine. The average gain in strength across the volunteers was 50%, similar to the little finger thing. What I didn't tell you is while each person was doing that, someone was watching them, just watching the fingers, nothing else, just literally their job was to watch this person stretching an elastic band. So they had their finger strength tested. Guess what happened? 33% increase in strength. See if you keep the ball going to the gym. You could sit in the cafe. And watch everyone else training. But the key is you've actually got to pay attention to the mechanical movements, right? You've got to, so if you're watching someone on the treadmill, you've actually got to watch them up, watch their legs. Keep watching them. Not mind-wandering, thinking of what you've got to do, pick up the kids, go to Tesco, whatever. Pay attention to the mechanical movements, right? It's called action observation. It's actually been shown to help people who've had a stroke. In fact, one study with people who've had a stroke between 1 and 14 years earlier, similar to the visualization study. Not just people just had a stroke, but up to 14 years earlier. Everyone does the physiotherapy. Another half of them get action observation. 1 hour a day, watching people doing that. Daft as it might sound, watching people eat an apple, turn the page of a book. Again, they improve much more than those who actually just got the physiotherapy. I'm just going to demonstrate how powerful this effect is when you take your belief in yourself into a situation where you're trying to assist someone else. Right? Of how powerful the effect is. When I remember one of the first talks I gave in this, one of my books is called The Contagious Power of Thinking. I wrote about all the mirror neuron thing. And see when you write a new book and you're out for the first time, I sometimes get a bit nervous in case, how are people going to receive this? And as always happens, the very first time someone doesn't agree. And it was a woman who said, no, I understand what you said, and you seem like a nice chap. I always leave with that line. And you seem like a nice chap, but I don't get this, because what you're telling me is completely opposite from what I experienced. My husband has been sitting in front of the TV watching the football for 20 years. And you're telling me he should be as good at football and as slim and as athletic as David Beckham. Only thing that's happened is he's gained 2.5 stone. And I said, well, actually, you kind of almost answered your own question. You said, what did you say to me? You said, he's been watching the football. I said, exactly. And she's like, I don't understand. I said, well, when he's watching the football, is he watching the mechanical movements of the player's legs and shoulders and watching the physical movements? Or is he watching the ball? And she said, well, he's watching the ball. And I said, well, the mirror neuron system works because he's now shaped like a ball. But it is a powerful phenomenon. But you can actually harness this. I've been interviewing and studying people for like more than a decade who've used mind-body interventions, as I call them, visualization techniques, to help facilitate the recovery from illnesses. In fact, you know that the most common use of visualization for people who've had cancer is they imagine the chemo drugs as little piranha fish going, nibbling the tumour. So the tumour's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it disappears. The most common visualization used by people in radiotherapy, bolts of lightning, and so the tumours get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Some people imagine the tumours are made of ice and they melt them. Some people are healers, imagine putting their hands on the ice and melting it. Some people put crystals on them. Some people put heat, lamps, blowtorches, whatever in your imagination. But what's consistent in every single case is this idea of smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, whether it's just willpower that's harnessed in that, probably is having a massive effect. But what if, as well, on some level, the brain must think that what you're imagining is actually happening? On some level, the brain must be processing it as if it's actually happening. So what I think, as well as harnessing willpower, which has an enormous effect in and of itself, I think what also happens is, on some level, the brain is processing wellness rather than illness. And if you consistently do it, just like gradual increases in thickness in the area of the brain, 30 to 20, 30, 40-fold increase in 5 days of doing that, then if the same principle is operating, then maybe on some level, the areas of the brain processing wellness are massively increasing, so illness is shrinking. And what that will eventually do is tilt the chemistry of the body, perhaps in the direction of wellness. And that's my one explanation of how I think these kind of things work, because people apply this to everything. So selective and typical for heart disease, people walk through their blood vessels in their imagination with a steam cleaner. Whether they clean their arteries, turn calcified chunks and brown diseased parts in their imagination into nice healthy pink cells, and they fill up black bags with all the debris and take it out of their body. Right? People who want to boost up the immune system, imagine going into the bone marrow and imagine a big furnace and putting coal in it, shoveling it up, putting energy into it, and imagine the heat coming off the immune system, and these little immune factors going on, and grappling viruses to the ground, wrestling to the ground, saying, hey, get out, and taking them out of the body. People so creative and imaginary. But what's happening in each case, whatever people apply this to, they're turning illness into wellness. Illness into wellness, illness, consistently over and over and over again. Actually, I gave a talk in London at Alternatives on Monday, and a boyfriend came up to me at the end. He says, one of our friends had very serious cancer. It was a lung cancer, but the tumour had grown so much it was strangulating his heart. It was right round the heart. It was attached to, and it was strangling the heart. And when he was going in for an operation, they were very worried about the success rate, and the surgeon had previously said this is a very dangerous operation. There is a good risk there is a high risk he might not come through that. So for months he started visualising. Because it was attached to the heart, he actually started imagining the space between the Earth and the Moon. This massive, he got this sense of space going into the space between the heart and this tumour, and imagine this expansiveness, and he could see a space. And after doing that for several weeks, he then imagined lathering the tumour with olive oil and making it really slippy, because he'd been told that it's going to be really hard to take off the heart without damaging the heart. So he imagined soaking it in olive oil, did it every single day. Anyway, he went in for the operation. I just got told this on Monday night. He went in for the operation, and the surgeon, at the end, was standing by his bed with a few friends, a few colleagues, and he said, well, really good news, it was nothing like we thought. In fact, this operation we performed in half the time, and he said, as strange as it might sound, I could have sworn it was caked in olive oil. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of that, but basically the key strategy, and as hypnotherapists, you'll relate to this, the key strategy was the person using their own imagination to come up with a concept of illness and consistently turn that into wellness. Illness into wellness over and over and over again, over and over and over again, over and over and over again. And that's pretty much what people do. I've been interviewing people for more than a decade, and it's the same pattern I see in about 95% of them. People do exactly the same thing. Right? And I'm not suggesting to do this instead of medical advice, but in addition to, just like we encourage to eat healthy, have a healthy mind, exercise, use your mind as well as whatever else you're doing, as well as your other therapies. So before I take some questions, I'm just going to leave you with one other piece of advice. That sometimes when you try to achieve wellness, let's say, or even a goal in your life, and the fear of it gets too much, and you think, what if it doesn't, you get this pang, what if it doesn't work, what if I don't get healed, or what if this person that I'm looking for doesn't love me, right? And you get this, you get that actual pang. It's a nervous, it racks you, it pulls you in. Well, here's a really clever little trick of neuroscience. The brain can't be in a state of fear and anxiety at the same time as lightheartedness. So what you really want to do is change the direction of resources in the brain. When you get into that fear, the resources move backwards to the fear and anxiety areas, the kind of self-preservation, the fight or flight kind of thing, and you get racked with fear. So what if instead, here's a little technique I came up with years ago called victory dancing. And you can do it at the end of a visualisation to celebrate the victory. So basically when this pang of fear comes, what you've got to do is burst into a silly little dance. It's going to be absolutely ridiculous. And you've got to keep doing it. Whether it takes you 10 seconds or a minute, you've got to keep doing it until you find yourself laughing or smiling at yourself, right? You must keep doing it until you find yourself smiling in that moment. And in that moment, the resources are not going backwards to the fear and anxiety places, racking you with fear. They're going forwards to the light-hearted, the prefrontal cortex and other areas that bring positive emotion. And the more you do it, the more your brain will start to associate this goal with feeling good, rather than associating this goal with fear. And when I first came up with this concept, like I do when I think of something, I dive into it. So I'm practicing victory dancing all the time. And at the time we were living in Windsor, and we were living about a mile from my office. I'm saying my office, Starbucks. I'm mostly caffeine zero at the moment. I like the taste of the coffee. I kind of flip between a sad life, that's my office. Anyway, I was walking to my office, and at the time I put my laptop in a rucksack, and I'm walking this mile. Laptop in my rucksack, and I'm practicing victory dancing. Just, when I sometimes do little prayers or visualizations for people, and I fire off a visualization. And what I want to do to celebrate the victory at the end is a wee dance. Obviously, you're walking along the road at 6:45 in the morning. You can't really do that. So what I initially did is I used to put my hands in my pockets thinking, Well, I can victory dance like that. And I wondered why some drivers were slowing down. Presumably they thought I was interfering with myself. So I upgraded it, and what I used to do is hold the side of my rucksack and just do that. I know what I'm doing. Then when I just get this burst of energy, I go, yeah! But there was this underpass halfway into Windsor from where I lived at the town centre, and there was 2 tunnels about 10 metres long going underneath the roundabout. And I would get there about 10 to 7 in the morning, and there's never anyone. I'd walked that road for 2 years. I think once I'd met someone at that time in that tunnel. So it's a pretty safe bet you can go to town with a dance. So I'd get there about 10 to 7, because it's actually a good way of building positive emotion anyway. Because it's like dancing, you get your endorphins going and you feel actually quite good. So by the time I get to the office, I'm actually feeling pretty happy and stuff. Anyway, I get to the step. It was coming up to Christmas at the time. And I was walking through, and I looked around me, it was 10 to 7, no one here. So I started off doing my favourite move. I watched Joey and Friends doing that. It's the only move I can do, actually. And then I was standing, I do that for a minute, then I start going, you can, just stay like this. I'm moonwalking, and then I'm star jumping round about, and I'm doing all these things, and I'm whipping round and fancy and twirling around. And at one point, I must have done my best ever dance. I mean, I could have been on Strictly. And I got right to the end of the tunnel, and I finished like that. And that's when I looked ahead of me. And there's a row of builders watching. And you know when you get so embarrassed, your face goes so red that you can melt candle wax in water. And do you know what, in these moments, isn't it true that you can't think clearly? Right? Because what happens is, on average, you lose about 60% of the resources from your prefrontal cortex, the higher order. They drain backwards to protect you. So you can't think clearly. So usually in those moments, what you do will probably be the wrong thing. So I went from that to, hello? But as I had started it, you've got to keep it up. So I'm there walking past and chatting to my friend Rice. And it reminded me, one of my favourite comedians is Billy Connolly. And I grew up watching Billy Connolly, listening to him on the tapes and then on TV. And I remember Billy Connolly talking about this kind of phenomena, that you start something, you've got to keep it up. And he said, when escalators first became fashionable, the late 60s, early 70s, he was on one for the first time. And he's got up an escalator at a shopping centre in Glasgow. And he's wearing his great big flary trousers, like that. And he's a young, trendy guy, trying to impress the ladies. He's halfway up and some ladies are looking at him, he's trying to maintain his cool, and good. And then he's thinking, when I get to the top of that escalator, it's got a gap there. Well, what if my flares? And now his heart's racing, he's going, God's sake, and his legs trembling. What if my trousers get sucked in? But he's still trying to maintain his cool. So he's in this total dilemma. He's trying to breathe, trying to look cool, because girls have been down the other side and he's going up. And at the same time, he's so nervous that when he gets right to the top, he trips, because he's trying to overstep it, say, he trips like that. But he said, rather than admit that you were afraid of the escalator, you've now got to pretend that that's actually how you walk. But what you do is you gradually phase it out. And I was kind of doing that, because as I was walking past these builders, I was gradually talking quietly to myself. When I got to the end, when I was just getting out of sight, I put my fingers back in my pocket. Anyway, testimony to the power of victory dancing. I can now talk about this publicly without getting embarrassed. It does actually work.
So, wasn't that amazing?
Thank you.